All right, so today we are going deep, deep into a pretty pivotal moment, in Chinese history. We're talking 1842 to 1911, the lead up to the fall of the Qing dynasty.
A lot of sources here, actually.
Yeah, we've got
Transcripts?
transcripts, some educational material,
Syllabus documents.
syllabus documents. It's kind of all over the place, but they all sort of paint this very compelling picture of how China went from like top dog, regional superpower to not.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it wasn't just like a sudden collapse,
Right.
It was a gradual kind of erosion of power,
Mm.
internal struggles combined with these external pressures that really just kind of chipped away at the foundations of the Qing dynasty.
So let's start with those internal struggles. By the 19th century, I mean, this is a dynasty that had been in power for centuries. Like they were starting to show some serious signs of strain.
Yeah, a dynasty that's been around for a while. Yeah, I mean, one of the most glaring problems was just straight up corruption. It was rampant throughout the government. And I mean, one example that really illustrates this is Hessian,
Hessian.
this high-ranking official who, I mean, he amassed a fortune through embezzlement.
Wow, Hessian. The sources really make him sound like he was just living the high life on everyone else's dime.
Hmm.
But how did this impact the average person in China?
Well, if you think about it, I mean, the money that Hessian and other corrupt officials were stealing, that was money meant for essential stuff like infrastructure, maintaining dams, dikes, basic upkeep.
Right.
And because that money was being funneled away, these critical projects were neglected.
And that neglect had some pretty serious consequences, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
China experienced a whole series of natural disasters during this period. You've got floods, droughts, you name it.
It was rough.
And because the infrastructure was so poorly maintained, these events, they just led to these just devastating famines.
So you've got this corrupt government, the infrastructure's failing, and then on top of all of that, to make matters even worse, the population is exploding.
Yeah, you said it. The population boom just put incredible strain on resources, which just made the hardship caused by the famines even worse.
Right.
So it's no surprise that all of this created this widespread discontent, and ultimately it was just a breeding ground for unrest and rebellion.
And that's something we will definitely be coming back to because those rebellions, they were a huge factor in the Qing dynasty's downfall. But before we get there, let's kind of switch gears a little bit
Okay.
and look at those external pressures that we're building at the same time.
So this is where the rise of modern imperialism comes into play.
Hmm.
As China's grappling with its internal problems, this whole new global order is emerging, and it's driven by industrialization, this thirst for new markets and resources.
And Great Britain, of course, at the forefront of this whole industrial revolution, is about to become a major player in China's story. But it wasn't exactly a friendly partnership, was it?
No, not really. Britain saw an opportunity to exploit China's weaknesses, and they did so through a very specific commodity, opium.
Okay, so opium, we know it's a highly addictive drug, but how did it become such a significant factor in China's decline?
Well, at the time, Britain had this huge demand for Chinese goods, especially tea.
Right.
But China didn't really need anything that Britain produced in return, so this created a trade imbalance. All this silver was flowing out of Britain and into China.
So Britain needed to find a way to kind of even out the playing field, and opium was their solution.
Yeah, that's it. British merchants started smuggling opium into China, and it didn't take long for it to become a major problem. Opium addiction, it just spread rapidly, particularly in those coastal areas, and it just led to social decay, widespread health problems, not to mention economic instability.
So even though the Qing dynasty was trying to ban the opium trade, there was so much corruption within the government that enforcement was practically impossible, and millions of Chinese people ended up addicted. So what was the breaking point? What finally forced the Qing dynasty to take a stand?
Well, in 1839, Chinese authorities, they seized and destroyed this massive shipment of British opium. We're talking over 1.5 million kilos worth.
Wow.
It was a bold move, but it also had some pretty major
I
consequences.
can imagine that didn't go over very well with the British.
Not at all, no. They saw it as a direct attack on their trade interests,
Mhm.
and they responded with military force.
Mm.
And this marked the beginning of the First Opium War.
And this is where we really start to see that technological gap between Britain and China.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Britain had all the latest weaponry and industrialized navy. They just completely outmatched the outdated Chinese forces.
Right?
The war ended in 1842 with China's defeat and the signing of the Treaty of Nanjing.
A treaty that would have pretty far-reaching implications for China's future.
That's right. The Treaty of Nanjing, it was essentially the first in a series of unequal treaties that were forced on China by Western powers. It forced China to pay reparations for the destroyed opium. They had to cede Hong Kong to Britain and grant British merchants unrestricted trading rights in a bunch of key Chinese ports.
So not only was China defeated militarily, but their sovereignty was severely undermined.
Exactly. The Opium Wars, they shattered China's illusion of supremacy and really exposed those deep vulnerabilities that had been festering within the Qing dynasty for quite a while.
So we've got all these internal problems, corruption, overpopulation, and now we add on this new external threat, Western imperialism. I mean, it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and as we'll see, these pressures, they only intensified in the coming years, and it just led to even more unrest and rebellion within China. I think it's safe to say that the Opium Wars were kind of a wake-up call for a lot of people in China.
Yeah.
It really exposed the Qing dynasty's weakness, and it fueled this growing sense of nationalism, especially among the Chinese people. And this sentiment, coupled with the ongoing hardships they were facing, it just created this fertile ground for rebellion.
And one of the most significant rebellions to come out of this period was the Taiping Uprising. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's described in the sources as this massive, almost like apocalyptic event.
It was a truly monumental uprising.
Oh,
The Taiping Rebellion lasted from 1851 to 1864, and it was essentially a civil war
wow.
that engulfed huge parts of China. It was led by this guy, Hong Xiuquan.
Hong Xiuquan.
And he was a charismatic figure. He kind of blended elements of Christianity with traditional Chinese beliefs
Yeah.
to create this unique ideology.
The sources really emphasize how compelling Hong Xiuquan's message was, especially for those who were, suffering under the Qing dynasty. So what were the core tenets of the Taiping Rebellion? What were they fighting for?
They were looking for some pretty radical change. The Taiping rebels, their goal was to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish this new utopian society. They wanted to abolish Confucianism, eliminate private property. They were promoting gender equality,
Right.
and they wanted to put an end to those unequal treaties with Western power.
Sure. So they were trying to create a whole new social order,
Yeah.
and they were surprisingly successful for a time, right?
There were, yeah. The Taiping rebels, they controlled a huge portion of southeastern China for over a decade. They established their own government, their own military structure.
Okay.
And their success, I think, can be attributed in part to the widespread discontent among the peasantry who, were really drawn to that promise of a more egalitarian society.
But ultimately, the rebellion was crushed.
It was.
So what led to their downfall?
Well, a number of factors contributed to their defeat. There were internal divisions, strategic blunders, and ultimately the combined forces of the Qing government and Western powers. It just proved too strong for the Taiping rebels to overcome.
And the human cost of this conflict was just astronomical. The sources mention a death toll in the tens of millions, making it one of the deadliest civil wars in history.
Yeah, the scale of the devastation is hard to even grasp.
Right.
It just left this lasting scar on China, both physically and psychologically. It's a testament to the intensity of the social and political upheaval that was happening during this period.
And the Taiping Rebellion wasn't the only uprising that the Qing dynasty had to contend with. Around the same time, you have another rebellion, the Nian Rebellion, that erupts in northern China.
Right, the Nian Rebellion. And while it was smaller in scale than the Taiping Uprising, it was equally significant in kind of demonstrating the Qing dynasty's declining authority. It was fueled by a lot of the same grievances: poverty, anger towards the ruling elite, and just this sense that the government was no longer able to provide for his people.
So you've got these massive rebellions that are tearing the country apart. You've got Western powers that are encroaching on their sovereignty and
Yeah.
a government that seems increasingly out of touch with its people. How did the Qing dynasty respond to all of this? I mean, did they just give up or did they try to fight back?
They did try to adapt. In the aftermath of the Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion, the Qing dynasty launched a series of reforms that became known as the self-strengthening movement. It was their attempt to modernize China,
Right.
kind of catch up with the West in terms of technology and military might.
It sounds like a pretty ambitious undertaking, especially given the state of the country at the time.
It was.
So what were some of the key goals of the self-strengthening movement? What were they hoping to achieve?
Well, they were focused on several key areas. They sought to adopt Western military technology, develop modern industries, strengthen the Chinese Navy. They even started building railroads, investing in new technologies like the telegraph.
So essentially, they were trying to blend Western technology with traditional Chinese values.
Yeah,
It seems like a really delicate balancing act,
they were.
trying to modernize without losing their cultural identity.
It was a very complex
Sure. Yeah.
and often contradictory undertaking,
Right.
and the reformers, they faced a lot of resistance from conservative factions within the government
Yeah.
who just saw modernization as this threat to the Confucian order.
So even as they're trying to modernize, they're battling against their own entrenched traditions.
Exactly.
Were there any specific events that kind of highlighted the limitations of the self-strengthening movement?
Yeah, the First Sino-Japanese War, which took place from 1894 to 1895, that was a major turning point. China's defeat at the hands of Japan, a nation that they had long considered inferior.
Right.
It really exposed the shortcomings of the self-strengthening movement,
Right.
and it underscored the need for more fundamental reforms.
It must have been a humiliating defeat for China, especially after all the effort that they had put into modernizing.
It was a major blow. The defeat, it shattered any remaining illusions about China's strength, and it really highlighted the growing power of Japan in the region.
So despite these setbacks, did the Qing dynasty continue to pursue reforms? I mean, did they try to kind of salvage the situation?
They did, but their efforts were often met with resistance,
Right.
and they were hampered by internal divisions.
Yeah.
And one key figure who emerged during this period was Empress Dowager Cixi.
Kixi.
She was a shrewd and powerful leader. She exerted considerable influence over the king court.
Sixie, she's a fascinating character. The sources describe her as this complex and often contradictory figure. Sometimes she supported reforms, other times she resisted them. So what was her role in this final chapter of the Qing dynasty?
Cixi, she was a master of political maneuvering.
Okay.
She understood that change was needed,
Yeah,
but she was also very conservative and determined to preserve the power of the Qing dynasty.
of course.
So her approach to reform was often pragmatic
All right.
and opportunistic.
So she was trying to navigate this very difficult path, balancing the need for modernization with the desire to maintain, traditional power structures.
Right.
What were some of the key events that marked the final years of the Qing dynasty?
Well, in 1900, Cixi supported the Boxer Rebellion,
The Boxer Rebellion.
which was this violent anti-foreign uprising.
Right.
And she was hoping to use it to kind of expel Western influence from China.
Okay.
But the rebellion, it just backfired spectacularly.
Yeah.
The Boxers were just brutally crushed by this multinational force.
Right.
And China was forced to pay heavy indemnities and grant even more concessions to foreign powers.
So the Boxer Rebellion, instead of strengthening China, it actually further weakened their position and increased foreign intervention.
It was a devastating setback.
Mhm.
The Boxer Rebellion really marked the end of any real hope for the Qing dynasty's survival. It became clear that the dynasty was no longer capable of governing effectively
Right.
or resisting foreign encroachment.
So it seems like every attempt to assert control, whether through reform or repression, it just made things worse.
Yeah, it's a classic example of unintended consequences.
Right.
The Qing dynasty's efforts to adapt to this changing world, it was often too little too late, and it frequently backfired, which further undermined their authority and just hastened their downfall.
So by 1911, the writing was on the wall for the Qing dynasty. I
Yeah.
mean, they're facing internal rebellion, they're facing external pressure. There's this growing sense that their time has passed.
Yeah, and the 1911 revolution, led by revolutionaries who were seeking to establish a modern republic, that was the final nail in the coffin.
Right.
The Qing dynasty, this once mighty empire that had ruled China for centuries, was swept away, and it marked the beginning of a new era for China.
So we've covered a lot of ground: internal corruption, external pressures from Western powers. We had those massive rebellions, failed reforms, and ultimately the collapse of a dynasty. What are some of the key takeaways from this period? What lessons can we learn from China's fall from grace?
I mean, if we connect this to the bigger picture,
Mm-hmm.
what we see is a nation struggling to adapt to a rapidly changing world.
Right.
And China's fall from grace wasn't just about external forces. It was also about internal weaknesses,
Right.
a failure to kind of embrace change, and a system that could no longer meet the needs of its people.
Yeah.
It really highlights the dangers of clinging to the past
Yeah.
when the world is shifting around you, and the importance of adapting to new realities.
It's a cautionary tale about the fragility of power and the consequences of failing to address, deep-seated problems.
Yeah, and it raises some important questions for us to consider.
Yeah.
How do societies balance the need for stability
Right.
with the need for progress?
Right.
And what are the consequences when that balance is lost?
Wow, those are some really thought-provoking questions. China's journey from regional superpower to a nation in turmoil. I mean, it offers some pretty powerful lessons about the forces that shape history.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even the most powerful empires are not immune to change,
Right.
and that the seeds of their destruction are often sown from within.
It's a story that challenges assumptions about power, about resilience, and about the forces that shape global history. Make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. So we've seen how the Qing dynasty just really struggled to adapt in the face of all these internal and external pressures. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to Empress Dowager Cixi.
Yeah.
She's such a pivotal figure in this whole period.
Right. How did she navigate all these turbulent times?
Well, Cetsi's rule was marked by this constant push and pull between tradition and modernization. She recognized that change was necessary,
Right.
but at the same time, she was deeply committed to preserving the Qing dynasty
Of course.
and her own power. And this often resulted in kind of contradictory policies and a real reluctance to fully embrace those reforms.
You know, the sources really depict her as this master of political maneuvering.
Okay.
It sounds like she was playing a very delicate game,
Yeah,
trying to appease both the reformers and the conservatives in the court.
exactly. Sexy was really skilled at manipulating those different factions within the government.
Right.
But but that also meant that her approach to reform was often piecemeal and inconsistent.
Right.
She'd support certain initiatives like developing modern industries,
Ugh.
but then simultaneously resist any changes that she saw as a threat to that traditional power structure. So this constant balancing act, it ultimately hampered China's ability to effectively modernize. Was there a particular turning point during Cixi's reign that really signaled the beginning of the end for the Qing dynasty?
I think the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, that was a critical turning point. It
Yeah.
was this violent anti-foreign uprising.
Right.
And Cixi initially supported it. She was hoping to use it to expel Western influence from China.
Okay.
But the rebellion, it backfired so dramatically. It
Yeah.
led to this humiliating defeat,
Right.
and it really just further weakened the Qing dynasty's authority.
The sources really paint this vivid picture of just the chaos and the brutality of the Boxer Rebellion. It seems like such a desperate attempt to hold on to power, even at the cost of further destabilizing the country.
It was a gamble that didn't pay off.
Yeah.
And the Boxer Rebellion, it really exposed the Qing dynasty's weakness and ultimately, I think, hastened its demise. The foreign powers, they were emboldened by their victory, and they imposed even harsher terms on China, which further eroded its sovereignty.
So after the Boxer Rebellion, was there any hope left for the Qing dynasty?
By that point, I think the dynasty was in a state of terminal decline.
Yeah.
You combine the internal rebellions, the foreign encroachment, economic instability, and just this loss of faith in the government's ability to rule it.
Right.
It had created a situation that was just unsustainable.
And then in 1911, the revolution finally came.
Yes, the 1911 revolution was led by this group of revolutionaries who wanted to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish a modern republic.
Right.
They were inspired by ideas of nationalism, democracy, social reform.
Of course.
And the revolution spread rapidly across the country. And within just a few months, the Qing dynasty was overthrown. And that marked the end of centuries of imperial rule in China.
So looking back at this tumultuous period from the Opium Wars to the fall of the Qing dynasty, what are some of the key insights we can take away from China's experience?
I think it's a story that really highlights that complex interplay of internal and external forces and how they shape a nation's destiny.
Absolutely.
China's fall from grace wasn't simply a result of Western imperialism.
Right.
It was also a product of its own internal weaknesses, the failure to adapt to a changing world, and the inability of its ruling elite to effectively address the needs and aspirations of its people.
It's a reminder that even the most powerful empires are not immune to decline, and that the seeds of their destruction are often sown from within.
I think so too, and it also underscores the importance of leadership, vision, and the ability to embrace change. in navigating turbulent times.
Yeah.
The Qing dynasty's failure to effectively modernize and reform that ultimately led to its downfall.
Well, this has been such a fascinating deep dive into this really pivotal moment in Chinese history.
It has.
And I think it offers some really valuable lessons about the dynamics of power, the challenges of modernization, and the importance of understanding the forces that shape history. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment.